It's been a 10-year journey from day job to quitting my cult 6 years ago, to deciding to live in New York 3 years ago, to starting to figure out how I could possibly do that, to now in this month coming on my first year living here. It's been a long journey, but I think a practice that has helped is just finding ways to get quiet. That's journaling, turn off technology, and just get quiet.
I love that.
Yeah, for anybody listening, I think that's one thing that has helped me listen to myself.
So Calvin, you have one of the most unique stories I've ever stumbled upon, so much so that you're the first non-technical person that I'm interviewing on this podcast. And you have this incredible story of growing up in a fundamentalist Mormon family. Tell us, what was that like on a daily basis, living with such a large family under these unique circumstances?
First of all, I just have to say thanks for this. You gotta love the randomness of life. We meet in Tulum. Well, actually, I saw a friend that I think he connected us there at that party, right? So I go to Tulum for the first time. I see somebody I recognize from like years ago, and then he connects us, and then we had such a great conversation. So I'm very grateful to be here. What was it like? That's an interesting question. It was normal. You know, a lot of people ask like, what was it like to have 4 moms, 1 dad, and dozens and dozens of siblings, all under one roof. And there wasn't anything else that I knew. As I've tried to explain it to people afterward, as I'm like now out of it, it was kind of like Harry Potter. If you lived on Hogwarts, like dinner time was always commotional, and we always had buffet style for some reason. Like a lot of families I've sensed where they like pass food down the table, we didn't do that. Like we would have prayer at the table, then everybody would get up and just get in line at the queue to go get their food. But I really think the most honest answer for myself is it wasn't unique to me. It is of course unique to the world, but we all form these little bubbles of normality around us. And how somebody was raised in India is going to have a different set of normal than somebody that lives in London or Austin, Texas. And so for me, not being exposed to other cultures, not because I didn't go to school, I didn't go to public school or any of that stuff. So yeah, for me, 4 moms and 1 dad and a lot of siblings, like that was just life.
That's so crazy. And I guess, you're right in saying like if someone grew up in a certain way, like they're out in India, like that's their norm. My story was like my normal. And then when I share my story, like, oh my God, that's so crazy and blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure you hear that all the time from people like, I can't believe you had 44 siblings. Yep. I mean, but for me too, it's so crazy.
And I had a really long conversation with a friend last night on sibling dynamics, because my friend, she has an older sister that's just 2 years apart. And I'm like, what was that like? Like, I'm curious about that. What's it like to just have one sibling, And one thing we uncovered with the dynamics is it's really difficult to have deep, meaningful relationships with like dozens and dozens of people. For me, I can't speak for everybody in fundamentalist Mormonism because it's a big movement. But for me, it was like a lot of just under the surface level relationships. Because, the way my parents raised us, we were really against any sort of favoritism. And so if you were favoring a certain sibling, God forbid they're from the same mom, because that's an interesting dynamic. Like we couldn't have favorites from siblings that were from the same mom. It had to we were to treat everybody the same, all the moms the same. And so that might be an interesting insight that I've learned out of it. It's like, oh, that's not normal. You can actually have a favorite, and it's okay to have a deep connection with a sibling or a parent that isn't just under the surface.
So what did you think was going to happen, or how did you, like, what was going through your mind when you were having bonds with, one of your siblings, and you're like, oh, I kind of like that sibling a lot more than this other sibling? Did you have to like stop yourself from thinking that way?
Yeah, not quite that far, but we had a curse word for it. So having multiple moms, that's called polygamy. And so what's the opposite of that? This is kind of funny looking at it now. Monogamy. So monogamy was like a slur where I come from.
Okay.
Like a curse word. So if we would tease each other as siblings, like you're acting monogamous. You're acting like you're being like monogamy. So that's what it would be. It'd be like, oh, am I acting monogamous by having favoritism and that sort of thing?
Yeah.
And if I didn't have those thoughts, then a sibling or a parent certainly would have corrected me.
Wow. Okay. And so what do you think about monogamy now that you're out onto the other side?
Like, that's a valid question, because one of my favorite things in the world is flying. I never get bored of it. I think it's one of those things where I think about, like, for 5,000 years, humans dreamed about this crazy thing, and we do it and we take it so for granted. And we're like literally above the birds. We hijacked an entire species technology and we do it better than them. Anyway, that's a whole other point. But I remember about a year ago, I've had, of course, relationships since leaving the religion. And honestly, I was like, am I going to be monogamous? Am I gonna, polyamory's kind of a common thing. Then there's open, and I had this realization of like, wait, I think I am a monogamous. I think that's what I want. It almost felt rebellious in a way, but in a good way. And so, of course, I think great about it, because there is just something to me that's special about two people pair bonding, getting together, and us against the world's kind of attitude. And I think some of that, gets a little bit messy as you add more to that number. Again, people can do whatever they're going to do, like, to each their own. But yeah, I love it. And again, that is a more recent realization in my journey that's like, yeah, monogamy can be fantastic.
I think that's, nowadays there's so many people who are, at least I think it's my age and where I'm at in my life. Like, I find like so many people having confusions about the type of relationships that they want, whether they're curious about their sexuality, or they're curious about whether they want to be monogamous, or they want to be in multiple relationships and have this polyamorous relationship. So it's interesting to me to hear that you grew up seeing your family, seeing your dad be a polygamist, and then you're consciously choosing that that isn't for you.
Yeah, my dad was, my grandfather was, all of my uncles were, like, it was the whole community. So to do the exact opposite of that, it was an interesting moment when I came to that. I'm like, oh, I think this is what I want ultimately.
Yeah. So going back to your siblings, were
Yeah.
you growing up, did you ever have friends outside of your family? And what was it like having, once you got out of the cult, what was it like finally forming friendships outside of the community?
That's been one of my favorite parts, because by the time I was, 20 years old, 99% of the people that I knew had the last name Wayman. Now, for anybody that's listening, that's my last name. So they were either family or like cousins. So I didn't have any deep connections with the outside world until my journey out. And so, yeah, I mean, that's been both a challenging journey and then a favorite one, because, when I left at 30 years old. I had lived an entire lifetime in that. And when I left, the majority of all of my social connections just became estranged overnight. So there was that period of intense, like, there is no connection to turn to. And then COVID happened. And so then you're really kind of on your own for a little while. But I had some like one-off stranger connections that were really enriching as I traveled, because, I ended up quitting my day job. And that's actually what kicked off this whole journey in a big way. Because then, now that I had an online business, I was remote, and so I could travel and so experience different people and cultures from all over the world, from Costa Rica to Israel, Thailand, London, Paris. So there were connections that way, just meeting people in the flow of life. But it's been really cool as I've been establishing myself here in New York to find people that are into the same thing, that challenge me in different ways. Yeah. It's something I'm cherishing, and still very much at the beginning of that journey, finding my core. And there's a lot of people I have just outside the core, like we all do improv together, let's say, or a friend of creators, or a small group of online entrepreneurs. But yeah, it's something I'm cherishing, and the few that are really tight and in there, I very much appreciate it. It's been a hard thing, but a fun thing to get to build.
Yeah. And how did you build those initial connections? Because, I can't imagine when 99% of the people that you knew had your last name, to suddenly you're out in a different community. How do you build those connections?
Piece by piece. So the strategy that's really worked for me, and I'm not saying this for everybody, like, I've done things, like I've done networking events, I've done there's something here in New York called Time Left or something, where they get strangers together and meet for dinner, and that can be fun. The thing that has by far been the coolest is just following my own curiosities and my own interests.
Mm.
Because through following my own curiosities and my own interests, then I meet people that are also in those similar circles and pathways. And that's where the very best connections have come from. Even literally where I live, like something as silly as right outside my apartment is basketball, like a basketball court. That was the one thing we had on the farm, because I grew up on a farm and like played basketball and there, and like I love basketball. And because of that, I end up meeting this guy that he's also into comedy. So we have done a little bit of comedy together or gone to shows and stuff like that. He ends up moving out of his apartment and saying, hey, this was before I actually had fully moved here, because all of 2022, I would travel back and forth from Utah to New York to see where I wanted to live. I had no idea how I was going to actually make it here or find a spot. And he was like, just to get the practice in, you should apply for my apartment because I'm leaving it. You probably won't get it because it's competitive, but just get the flow. And I applied and I got it, the first and only apartment I ever applied. So moving here actually became quite easy. But again, he is a friend, a good friend. We hang out here and there. That just happened from doing my thing. I mean, case in point, this whole conversation is doing my thing. Like meeting in Tulum and then leading to this. And so I think and then other random stuff like that just pops up, like playing basketball with Adam Sandler. Actually, he started coming to the basketball court, and that's just wild to be like, wait, a few years ago I was like in a cult, and now I'm guarding Adam Sandler, and he's shit talking me. Like, it's so wild. And yeah, I think that's probably, I'll just leave it there. That's the best thing that I've found, is continuing to just lean into what am I interested in, what am I curious about, go in those spaces, and then let things organically blossom with connections from there.
Yeah, you're absolutely in a state of flow where you're staying true and you're staying authentic to who you are and what you're curious about. And I'm a true believer that is when you're in that frequency of authenticity, things just naturally happen for you, and then you look back and you're like, whoa, this was a crazy life I've been living. But to you, it's almost like it's normal. As we say, it's normalcy.
Well, the thing is, the life after is way, like, if you call this the normal world, that doesn't feel normal. Like, this stuff feels magic. Like, the stuff that happens in that flow, to me, is more of what you're saying, where you step back and you're like, how did this happen? Just silly stuff. Like, you probably know Gary Vee. His videographer is D-Rock. And like, just the other day, it was D-Rock's birthday, and so I had messaged him happy birthday, and I leave my apartment and he's walking past my apartment. I'm like, dude, I'm looking at, and then we talked for like 30 minutes. Like, just synchronicity. There's stuff like that's been happening wildly in the last couple of years, especially. And so, it's a strategy I like, and I'm gonna stick to it.
Oh, I love that. I read this book, Deepak Chopra, called The Spontaneous Fulfillment of Desire. And one of the takeaways that I got from that book is for you to start jotting down coincidences that are happening in your life. And I feel like since doing that, like, I've been seeing way more synchronicities, way more crazy coincidences that I can't even explain, that I'm like, whoa, this is like, I feel like I'm living in a matrix or something.
It's been wild. It really has. Like, again, having deconstructed an entire belief system, one of the things that have come out of that for me is I am very slow to conclude anything. A lot of people say, oh, it's this, it explains this, the stars do that, it's because it's this day, the numerology says this. I don't jump to that. I'm more like, I can explain this, but it's wild. People have their explanations of why things are happening, and I just bask in it. Like, again, another name, like, this is happening a lot with just crossing paths with different people, since we're talking about connections. Chris Voss has a book. Some listeners will probably know who he is. He has a really cool book called Never Split the Difference. Yeah. And I had just read his book. I was like, I really love this guy. I love what he's about. And, I'm into psychology. I had to be, I got really curious about my own psychology while I was in the cult I studied the cult, but what I really got into getting curious about is what's keeping me here? What keeps anybody here? Why am I in this one versus another one? And that sort of thing. So I've always been into that. But this also just recently happened. I was just walking down the street and Chris Voss and I crossed paths crossing the street after just reading his book. Like, this is wild. Like, all this since meeting you in Tulum. There's been so many strange things, and we had a pleasant conversation. I was like, yo, hey. And we had a
You're
good
welcome.
exchange.
I tend to do that to people.
There's been a lot of, it's wild. So maybe, you know what? You could be the catalyst of all of this, because a lot of it has happened since Tulum. So maybe it wasn't Tulum. Maybe it was your coincidence, your coincidence magic or whatever rubbing off.
Maybe. I mean, you and I had we had like just met, for the listeners. We had just met through a mutual friend. It's loud. And our mutual friend was like, hey, meet Calvin. He has 44 siblings. And me going into my like curiosity mode, just started asking him. I don't think I even told you my name. I just started bombarding you with questions like I'm already on my podcast or something.
Yeah.
And I think, and maybe like if I had to assume, because I had you open up so much of your personal space to me, like it maybe opened up like you're energetically where you started becoming like that, like fully authentic energy. And again, the highest frequency as a human you can have above love is authenticity, and perhaps all the synchronicity started coming in from then. I don't want to take credit, but I think that has a little bit to it.
It's a core value. It's a core value. I thought freedom was my top value for a long time, and what I learned was it was actually authenticity, and that's what ultimately led me to leave everything and start life over at 30. But yeah, that's something I also appreciated. Just in Tulum, we just meet and then like we went deep fast. It was good.
Yeah. So I want to go back to your story of being in a cult, because now you're living a completely opposite life. I mean, you live in New York City. It's like all walks of different people. You have mostly people who get out of their family, their communities to like live this big city life. But how did you get there? Like at what point in your life were you like, okay, this is you were like, okay, I'm in a cult, or what was that trigger realization for you that made you want a different life?
I really love that we're in this conversation of authenticity, because whenever I've talked about this story, it's like times and places and doubts, but I love that we're approaching it with this level of authenticity, because that's really what drove it. As I started to travel and experience the world, it became very clear that my way of living was not the only way of living, like the way I was raised. So then the question is this the way for me? Like, why does anybody believe anything? And as I learned like scary statistics of like whatever somebody's belief system is at 18 years old, it's like a 78% likelihood that was their parents' belief system.
Yeah. I'm
like, whoa, wait a minute. This whole time I thought I'm believing in this because it's the truth, it's the right thing. But is that really what I'm into? And so I dived deep in asking myself what I wanted, what I believed in. And those were scary questions. They were really scary questions, because the way I was raised, there was only one thing I could not repent of. Heaven and hell was a big thing in fundamentalist Mormonism. And of course, there's the big sins, not murder and that sort of thing. But one of the things that you couldn't ever repent from is leaving, because what we were taught was that God gives each of us gifts, and it's up to us to make the most of those gifts. And if we do the opposite of what was intended, we will be punished accordingly. And I was taught that I was such a valiant soul in heaven before this life that God let me be born in the one true church left of a very big and evil and wicked world. And if I turn against it, it's like flipping off God. And so I felt like I had to overcome the belief that choosing to leave, I'm damned forever. Like I'm going to hell. And what it came down to is recognizing I've got one life. And how do I want to live it? Do I want to live it like all these things that were scaring me, I recognized were for outside in. My parents, my grandfather, who's one of the church leaders, they were saying, read these books, be this way. They were telling me this is the truth. And then I'm comparing that to up close experiences of other people that I was told these are bad people. These are scary people. Or I'm like, there's like a conflict here. Which one am I going to listen to? This is where it comes down to. Am I going to listen to the outside voice? Or am I going to listen to what I discovered directly internally, knowing that if I'm wrong, I could be damned? And what I came to is I would rather live the rest of my life that way, even if it meant I was going to be damned, because I didn't want to live a life that wasn't true to what I felt from my own lived experiences. Yeah. And that was the kickoff. It was that decision of, this is going to piss a lot of people off. This is going, like, there wasn't a single person in my life that thought it was a good idea. But it was that. It was like, but I'm living with myself forever. And I don't want to, if I have to die on my own sword, so to speak, then I will. I just don't want to live my entire life and not know who I actually am, or just be changing my belief system based on external forces instead of internal ones. Anyway, that's what kicked it off. And that's what made me say, yeah, I don't resonate with these beliefs. I'm going to leave.
Yeah. And that, to me, like, if I didn't know you were talking about being in a cult and I only heard just that one clip, I would have thought like you were talking about leaving a company as an employee and then going to start your own company because you have this set of beliefs about something that's really strong and you're listening to your intuition. I'm curious, like, how do you know when your intrinsic thoughts and your, like, what your gut is saying is something that you should follow and listen to? Because I know a lot of people second guess, myself including. Like, there's so many times where I feel very indecisive about a lot of things, whether it's work related or personal related. So how do you know what's the truth and what to actually listen to intrinsically?
That is such a good question, Jenny. I think the fast, quick answer is, I don't know if you totally can. I don't know if you totally can always know. That's why it's called a leap of faith. But I think there are practices that in retrospect, I think really helped. My longest standing habit, longer than brushing my teeth every day, I've skipped a day or two. It's not a good thing, is journaling. I've been journaling every day since I was 17. And so I've done it on my computer, and it's actually fun because I can time travel now. Like, I did it 2 days ago, where all of it's in one document.
Oh my God, I say that too.
Who was I a decade ago? And it's so cool because I just go to where I was a decade ago and I see my mindset and I'm like, man, it's so interesting because in my memories, I'm the same person. And then I actually go read my journal. I'm like, whoa, that's so different. I think that helped. I think what also helped was, well, it didn't start when I decided to leave the religion. It started when I left my 9-to-5. I think that's really it. It's because, so that's actually really cool that you said that, because I did do that as far as, like, I really believe, like, I didn't want to work for anybody else. I wanted freedom. And it's funny now because I thought freedom was financial freedom. I thought it was geographical freedom, but it was just leaning, like, that was really scary when I made that decision to leave, because I quit my day job cold turkey with no guarantees of what I was doing. I didn't even know what I was going to start. I just knew I didn't want to be an employee anymore. Yeah. And what made me overcome that fear, it wasn't something that overcame the fear. It was actually a bigger fear. I had imagined waking up in 10 years. And it's funny because I'm actually approaching it now, that 10-year mark. I was like, what if I woke up in 10 years and I was still at this day job? Or what if I woke up in this fire I have to create something and to make my own life? What if that fire died? Yeah. What if it died because I didn't act on it? And the fear of that happening is what made me quit my job and start the journey. And so I was on that path by the time I was like, whoa, I think I don't believe in this religion I'm born into. And so I think it was like building up that muscle of like leaning into authenticity. And you can start slow and start small. And again, we're talking about this like it just happened like this. It's been a
Yeah.
journey. It's been a 10-year journey from day job to quitting my cult about 5 years ago, 6 years ago, to deciding to live in New York 3 years ago, to starting to figure out how I could possibly do that, to now in this month coming on my first year living here. So it's been a long journey, but I think a practice that has helped is just finding ways to get quiet. That's journaling. I've also done this practice where about once a quarter I turn off technology. In fact, I have one scheduled this weekend because we just wrapped up a quarter where I turn off my phone for 2 or 3 days and just get quiet. And I think in that it has helped me find those small things of like, oh, this is what's coming through. This is what I actually feel and think and believe. So
I love that.
yeah, for anybody listening, I think that's one thing that has helped me listen to myself. Again, starting small, but then finding spaces of quiet so that you can hear yourself.
I love that. And you're actually the first person that has said time traveling, because that's what I share with people that want to learn about my whole journaling techniques as well. Because when I look back at my journals, as you said, I feel like I'm traveling back in time. And what it's also helped
really?
me
That's
to
a
do.
phrase you already say? It's funny.
Yeah. And what it helps me to do is like,
That's cool.
when I look at what I've written, and if I'm still thinking that way, there's a way for me to like analyze like, oh, I don't really want to be that person anymore. So as an example, like I remember this was like 2 years ago, I read a journal from 10 years prior, so 12 years in total now. And it was me
You've
just
been
being
journaling a long time too.
I've been journaling, since I was like 6 years old. And so I found this old journal, which is now
that's
12
really
years
cool.
old. And it was just very frantic the way I was writing, like the things that I was worried about, like the little stupid details and things that just didn't matter. And so when I read that or reread that, I was like, holy shit, I don't want to be this anxiety filled, crazy person. I need to stop thinking and caring about all these little things. And so, journaling has been a big, big part of my practice as well.
That's really cool. Yeah, I don't hear that very often of people that have done it for years and years and years. So that's really cool.
Yeah,
You got me beat
one
by
thing that
11 years. You've been journaling since 11, or sorry, since 6. That's great.
Yeah. And the other thing that I heard from your response is this element of time that, like, I think most people carry on their lives and their days thinking we have this infinite amount of time until we actually die. And to me, those who truly live different types of lives that like where they're fully authentic or they're really successful in their own ways are those who consider time as a very limited resource, and it strikes to them like, oh shit, I might die tomorrow or next year, and they start to reshape their entire life and how they're living because they have that fear of I might not be here tomorrow. And that's kind of what I heard from you as well.
Yeah, that's right. There's this quote that I learned after, but it's the principle is the same. I think it's a Confucius quote that's like, every man has 2 lives and his second life begins when he realizes he only has one.
Yeah.
Coming from fundamentalist Mormonism as well, like we are taught that our life is just a small blip in this whole grand thing. And I've done ayahuasca and stuff like that, and I've experienced things what some would call past life things. And I mean, I hope there's something before or after and that sort of thing. But the thing I know for sure is I've got this one. Like I hope there's something after this, but the thing I know is I've got this one. And the way I was raised is we were taught to be so careful to mess it up, because if you mess up this little blip, then it doesn't just mess up this life, it messes up an eternity. So people live so carefully. And that didn't make sense to me. I wanted to, like, the people that inspired me were people that, they were the bold people that got on the ships and explored new lands, or they decided to find a new route somewhere, find a new way of something. Like, those are the people that really inspired me. And so it just didn't make sense that I didn't want to waste the one thing I knew for sure I have. Again, I hope there's something after this, but I don't know. I just know that for sure I'm right here talking to you, and I want to live that way as well as I can. Fully maximize this experience.
Absolutely. Like To me, you're speaking like a true visionary, someone who's able to think outside of what they currently have presently and just working towards that vision that you have for yourself. And my next question to you in regards to that is like, how does your siblings, how do your family view you and how you're living now?
I don't know. I think it's a mix. So I'm really close to a handful of siblings. So some of my family and I, when I decided to leave, we had a big falling out. But I'm actually really good now. I'm on good terms with my entire immediate family for the most part. I don't think there's like from parents to siblings, it's all well and good. I think what I've just had to accept is, at the beginning of the journey, I think I felt a little bit gypped. If I want to use that word, there's another word I'm not remembering, by the universe, that I was born in a cult, that nobody really gets this, that nobody understands it, and that sort of thing. But first of all, I don't think that's true. I've had some deep, amazing conversations with people living completely different lives, but there's like maybe they don't have 44 siblings, but they've experienced loneliness, and they know what it feels like to be alone, even amongst people. Or maybe they didn't grow up in a cult where they feel trapped, but can't leave it, but maybe they were in a toxic relationship. And so when it comes to my siblings and like how they think of me, or what they think, I think one of the things I've started to shift the last few years is to not concern myself so much about that and accept that I'm going to be misunderstood. And
I
how
love
could it be
that.
any other way? Like if they haven't lived the way that I've lived and seen the things that I've lived, I liken it to, Plato's allegory of the cave. If anybody's ever, heard the old story of, people living inside of a cave and then they leave the cave. It's like the person that's out of the cave trying to explain to the people still in the cave what it's like. Of course, there's no frame of reference. And so
Mm.
I think what I try to do instead is just, instead of being angry about it or feeling like it's unfair that they don't get it or whatever, just recognize it for what it is, accept it, and have compassion for it, for myself and for them.
And you mentioned something about loneliness, and a lot of times people who are on path to greatness and those that see vision for a different future for themselves, they often walk this life of loneliness in a way. And I'm curious if you have those moments where sometimes you're misunderstood, sometimes you feel like you don't have that sense of belonging because you grew up in such a different way than most people do in New York City.
Way less now, interestingly. Loneliness is the biggest conversation that's hard to quantify and talk about, because it's hard to, sometimes I don't even remember how lonely it got during the transition out. Like that's where it was the most intense, because we are social animals, we are social
Yeah.
creatures, and I don't think we are equipped to have like that social circle rug ripped out from under you and feel like you're just flailing. It truly felt like I was naked outside of the camp, and it's snowing and frozen and there's nowhere to go. And so I'm sure I still have those here and there, but nowhere near as challenging as it was those first couple of years. Like leaving everything, the self-doubt, like that came crashing after I made the decision. It wasn't just, oh, I decided, now I'm good. No, like it was like I made a decision that is unalterable. Like there was no going back once I decided it. But there was so much self-doubt, and so the self-doubt packed on to the loneliness, I think it certainly intensified it. And it
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of things there on like how, like how I crawled out or what happened. But I think now I found, first of all, my life is bigger than that. I grew up in a cult. It's bigger than my past. And so it's what I'm into now. Like I have these moments, these spontaneous moments of joy that I hadn't had
Mm.
before, in the last year or two living in New York City, where just suddenly in the afternoon, I feel like really happy. And I'm like,
Mm. Mhm.
whoa, this is new. So I think
Mm.
that's probably, like, that's something I'm really grateful for. And then also finding people that are, again, into the same types of things. Yeah, it's
Mm.
really cool, where I come from and my past and all that sort of things. But I just feel like that there's been the relationships that I'm forming. It's deeper than that. Like we relate on other human layers.
Mm.
For
Mhm.
example, like one of my friends, she didn't grow up in a fundamentalist polygamous cult, but she grew up on a very strict fundamentalist Islamic family. And so we connect on that deeply,
Mm.
on what the family dynamics are like. And I relate to her because there are certain things about her life that she doesn't say out loud to her parents. And I really understand why. And she says, why? Because, well, the way she's like, the way I was raised, if I do something wrong, it's my parents' fault. And I don't want to put that on them and make them feel that way. And so you just feel that like, oh, I totally get what that is. And so you find these ways of connecting that is just such a human thing. And so, yeah, I think we're going to have moments of loneliness and stuff like that. But I think to tie this back to something we've been talking about, which is authenticity. Here's something I've really learned, and I think it's so helpful to remember. I used to feel bad that all of my connections when I was in the religion dropped. But then I think about, well, was I truly myself when I was in it? And the answer is no. Just as I want to be authentic, I want to have authentic relationships.
Yeah.
And indeed, those are probably the only relationships I ever want. And if they didn't last when I was being truly myself, it probably wasn't what I thought it was. And so I have accepted that, like this has been my best chance to ever to develop deep emotional connections because I'm myself more than I've ever been. And so if I'm being myself more than I've ever been, then you're attracting other people that are on that same wavelength that get your brand of weird, the way you see the world. And one or two of those really good, deep connections is worth 1,000 of like shallow ones that are just people that the name, I feel.
Absolutely.
And so
absolutely.
I'm just so early. I'm so early in this journey still, being a year here in New York City. But I've seen enough signs that I'm excited for the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years, really leaning into this idea of authenticity and then seeing what connections come from it. Because for a long time, I didn't know that. After I left, I didn't know if I was going to have other connections or if I threw it all away and I made the biggest mistake in my life. Like that was a big conversation right after.
I could only imagine how terrifying that must have been. And what really resonated with me on what you just said is just going back to, law of attraction, meaning like you attract what you are. And I think our society just lives where you're putting up a front, right? And so you have these superficial relationships because you're putting up a front, and therefore you're also attracting people who are putting up a front. And for me, like, and I might edit this part out, but like I realized in like my personal relationship, especially my romantic relationship, like with my previous ex-boyfriend, he was absolutely mirroring my relationship with my parents because I could not fully be authentic with him. Like I had to like be this perfect girlfriend, or I had to, I couldn't say certain things. I couldn't behave a certain way. I just had to be this like prim and proper. And I tell my current boyfriend now, you've met him very briefly when we were in Tulum. I tell him now, I'm like, I'm sorry, my exes got the best of me, but you get all of me.
And I'm sure he would agree with that every day. Like I want all, but and then the true part, the real parts, because I don't know, there's something like I'm in love with the messiness of what makes of who we are as humans, and all of us count the messy parts too. And yes, the best parts, but then there's these other parts that if you can't be that, you don't get to express it. I think people miss out on it.
Yeah. And you're just like kind of, at least for me, I was like on edge all the time. Like, cause I was like, oh, when is the shoe going to drop? Like, when's he going to figure me out? Like, when's he going to figure the real me out? And it's not a great feeling to live a life or any of your relationships in that sense.
Can I just drop in? Cause I know this isn't a relationship podcast, but this same thing totally applies. I can't tell you, like, I grew up never dating because we were taught arranged marriage only, church arranged marriages and that sort of thing.
Wow. Yeah.
And so done a lot of dating in the last 4 or 5 years. I've caught up, I'll say. But the thing that's been such a fun lesson is my favorite. I've met some really cool people. I've had some not so good experiences. But the thing that I've learned is how cool when you are truly yourself, the people that jive with it, they go with it. There's also people that you turn off fast. That is a good thing. That is a good thing. You don't want to be spending a lot of time necessarily in that already anyway. So I guess that, like, if I'm just in the nature of like wanting to provide value to somebody, like, you don't want everybody to like you. You want the people that really get you to
Yeah.
be in your life. And so in my advice would be as much yourself
Yeah.
as you can be, especially early on, because it will become its own selector. you know
Yeah.
the people that jive with it will jive with it, and the ones that don't won't. And
Yeah.
they're both good. And
Absolutely.
I've
And
had some really good connections choosing to do that.
yeah. And that translates to beyond romantic relationships and dating too. Like, I'm just tying this back to
Mm-hmm.
corporate life and entrepreneurships. It's, you got to find people that really resonate to your core values. You can't just have like company core values and hope that people would fit into it. It's like, no, like those are your
Yep.
people. Like, especially in a startup where you don't know if you're going to have, another day to survive. You're tied to these people that you're working with. Let's hope that you are fully
Mm-hmm.
authentic and you're glued by the values that you share, as opposed to money or
Yep.
revenue numbers or whatever it is.
Totally. Couldn't agree more.
So let's talk about your book. Let's talk about your book, Fish Out of Water, which is
Okay.
a book about not just reaching goals, but sustaining and living that transformed lifestyle. First of all, I saw on Amazon that there are exactly 43 reviews. So that's one review from each sibling, except for the one that you really pissed off.
Oh, interesting. I don't think
Yeah.
any of them have. That's fascinating. Yeah. That's funny. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, tell us about the concepts that you're teaching in this book.
Yeah, I wrote Fish Out of Water the tail end of while I was still in the cold, actually. It's a very entrepreneurial book. I didn't even mention anything in the book about where I come from at the time. It's a book for entrepreneurs that are going for something bigger. One thing I learned in my own entrepreneurial journey is, and you see this all the time when people set New Year's resolutions, they have a great idea, so there's motivation to go after it. And then inevitably everybody hits this phase where you start to really self-doubt. The motivation has gone away. You're flailing. It feels like you feel like a fish out of water, hence the title. I thought, now here's the tragedy. The tragedy is when people hit that stage, they usually stop progress. They're usually like, oh, I need to go back, or they revert to what they're used to. They revert to what their normal was. Maybe they go back to a day job, whatever. What really helped me getting to meet, other entrepreneurs and stuff that have been through this process is, oh no, this is normal. This is part of the process. It's like, this is actually a good sign when I hit this phase. And so think of it as like an approach to entrepreneurship or an approach to life to get through that stage and to go out and actually become who you really want to be. That's what I talk about. I just give things that have worked for me and others to, it's a quick read. My plan was, that if somebody picked this up at an airport, they could read it in a one-way plane trip. And so it's just a concise read on getting clear on who you are, what you want, and then tools to actually get through that fish out of water stage so you can get to the other side and be who you really are.
So looking back now with all of the experiences you've had, when does that fish start, becoming a reptile and they can live on land?
Yeah. I don't know. There's always a new game, right? So in the book, I call it going from a guppy to being a shark. Like, a shark's not a bad thing in the book. A shark's like somebody that's gone through the things and like they own the water they swim in. And I think it just comes with time, because then you get the results and then you're there, but then you go after a new thing. But to me, that's the exciting part of life. Like, I don't want to be done ever. I want to always, be pushing myself to see whatever I can do next. One of the things, like, you don't know this, you saw Fish Out of Water, but a big question I asked myself was, oh, that was a nonfiction book. Could I write a children's book? And so I actually wrote a children's book too. About empowering young kids. Like, I was like, what's a lesson I would want to know, like, super early on. And so I like to do these types of things mentally and physically. I do physical challenges as well. I like to, break what is possible, like break my brain in a good way of like, I once thought this was impossible. I didn't know if I could do this or anybody could do this. And so, yeah, I think it's just a cycle. It's never going to stop if you want to have a life full of adventure, which if I've got one, that's what I want.
I love that. One common core value that a lot of corporate companies incorporate is this idea of growth mindset and having an open mindset. Yet I don't think a lot of companies actually know how to teach this to their employees and to their team. So what's your best advice to give to leaders on how to teach this to their team to be open-minded and to be more growth-oriented?
This is a little bit out of my depth, Jenny, to be honest. It's something I'm very much curious about, and it's something I'm trying to formulate myself. I mean, it's what, literally my book, Mistakes Are Okay, Maggie May, is a book to develop growth mindset in kids. And so, I mean, the lesson I put in there, but done in a fun way, is making mistakes okay. I think a lot of times I have this, I don't know if it's true, but it just feels intuitively true, that humans already are that way, and that we actually unlearn it somehow through getting burned, getting hurt, and then we start playing more safe and more fixed and more dogmatic. And so just remembering it's okay to mess up. It's okay to try things. It's not the end of the world. Encouraging mistakes, celebrating mistakes. I mean, what is entrepreneurship if not that? Building a business is like, it's iterative, it's learning. It's like the thing I love about Jeff Bezos is he always early on I was like day one. Like they always had this mentality of, we're starting now and we're continuing to learn, and the best companies do that. Again, I don't have a particular framework. I ought to, so that I can go into corporations, and that's one thing that I do. And because I've actually been working with speaker people trying to find out different topics I could do when I'm doing like presentations and stuff, and this is along those lines. So I need to come up with something more clear. But the simplest thing, just based on my children's book, is embracing failure, whatever the frick that is, and creating a safe space for it. Because I think a lot of people have learned, oh, you got the question wrong on the test, bad. And here's one thing I do think. I think some leaders punish too quickly. They punish mistakes and things instead of celebrating it. And I think there's ways of doing that in a productive way where you're like, okay, this was the mistake, but what did we learn from it? So foster that instead of, excellence is not getting it right the first time. It's that continual progression of learning. And it's through that pursuit that it's only in hindsight that, oh, it turned out to be excellent.
And I think it's still, at least to me personally speaking as a leader, like a concept that I'm still trying to grasp myself, because saying like create a safe space. What does that look like, right? So especially as a startup, when you have limited time, limited resources, you want to encourage people to make mistakes, but how costly is that mistake to you? Short run versus long run, right? It might be costing the short run, but it might actually pay off in the long run. I don't know. I don't know the right answer to that.
I don't know the right answer either, to be honest. So I'm not going to speak too deep on it just because it's not there. I know Alex and Layla Hermosi are really big. I mean, they're big on this. I've seen Layla talk about this sort of thing. And so it's certainly something because you're so right. Because, I mean, if it's an established business that's been around forever, that's one thing. But if it's like, no, mistakes can like sink a whole company. Like, how do you approach that? And I just don't have any experience or data to back that up. So I'll just be give an opinion at that point. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Just if I may, I know this is your podcast, but I am curious because Wonder is a startup, or was, and you built it from the ground up. So what have you come to? Like, how do you make sure people aren't being fixed in their views and that they actually are?
Yeah.
That's what you're.
I'm still learning. I'm still learning, to be honest. I've been doing this for 8 years, and I'm still making mistakes on how to be a good leader. How old are you, if I may ask?
Just curious.
Yeah, I'm 31, and I've been doing this for 8 years now.
Okay, you've been, so you got in the game early with building startups. I'm somewhat jealous. You must have done it right out of school.
Yeah. I was working on another startup, and then ended up that failed and ended up starting an agency. But I think for me, the biggest hurdle in the early years was just constantly having this imposter syndrome because I'm in my early 20s working with people who are much older, way more experienced than I was. And for me to lead people who knew, I was the blind leading people who already saw things, right? So I'm like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. I don't know how
Right.
I'm doing this. So it's a lot of self-doubt that I had, which, over time, I've
For
came to
sure.
overcome that. And it just constantly fighting my thought process of I'm not good enough.
To wrap up the previous thought, because I did have an idea, because there is the one thing that occurs to me is when it comes to startup world, as far as like growth mindset, I think you have to just blend it with, yes, mistakes and iteration is there, but then you can still have high standards. So don't drop the standard, hold on to the vision, this is what we want, like don't lose that, but still be somewhat flexible on exactly how we're going to come to it and how we're going to learn it, that sort of thing, and not be so fixed on it. So that aside,
Actually,
all right.
I have a follow-up question for you because I saw in one of your interviews with Anthony Padilla, I think that's his name. There was a
Yeah, yeah.
story
Mm-hmm.
you were recounting to him about when your grandmother was passing away on her deathbed. You said that she
Yeah.
was saying, "I hope
Yeah.
I was good enough. I hope I was good enough." And I'm wondering if
Yeah.
there's any part of you that still relates to that feeling, or if there's any of those kind of self-doubts that you still carry with you.
All the time, big time. Yeah. Yeah. A lot of self doubt. So I guess the question is, well, how? I'm not saying the way I overcome self doubt is the way everybody else should, but it depends on how big the self doubt is. When I made the decision 3 years ago to move to New York, even though I'd left the cult, I was still in the vicinity of the cult, and I realized, like, again, tying back to authenticity is like, where do I want to live? And you also had mentioned earlier, it's like, oh, that's such a big change. Yeah, perhaps, but I've never felt more comfortable in my life being here, because like people say, why did you choose New York? It's the first place I've ever been where I feel like I can fully relax. That's not a thing you hear about New York, but
No, you don't. Yeah.
when you're being yourself and you're in a space where you can be yourself, you can just relax. But I started to find little pieces, and this is going to tie back to what you're asking as far as how to overcome the self-doubt. But huge imposter syndrome when I was like, I'm going to live in Manhattan. I don't want to live in Brooklyn or Jersey or somewhere close. I want to live in Manhattan, because that's, if I'm going to do it, I want to go for it. And I started to find little pieces of what I could control to get there. And one thing I've noticed in my life, with my life and humans, is the more normal something can feel, the easier it is to get through it. So the thing that was most in my control at the time was watching YouTube videos of people living in New York City, because then I could imagine it. That was one thing. And then I made a little bit of money from my online business, and I saved up a little bit, and I'm like, well, I could go travel to New York City. And so through 2022, I traveled to New York City,
Yeah.
tried on different neighborhoods to see where I wanted to live, like imagined it. That's where I met
Yeah.
my friend. This was his apartment that I now live in, and that sort of thing. But again, I was just living off of savings at that point, because I had a major client in my online business in 2021 that like closed his business down. He was like, I'm going to go be a dad. And he was going through a big thing to have a baby. And so I was just like, I'm just going to live this year off of just my savings and like travel to New York and figure out my life. But at the end of 2022, when I left New York City, I totally ran out of money, and the self-doubt just hit me like a ton of bricks. I didn't know if I could do anything. And so the way I got through that self-doubt was a crazy physical challenge. Not saying anybody should do this, but when I do something that feels impossible, it just reminds me that what I'm capable of. And so one thing I had always been curious about is if I could run 50 miles in a day without training for it, because I had heard somebody that had done that before.
What?
And so I know this is not what
This
you're
is
not
not where I
expecting. I'm
thought you
not
were
using
gonna
this
go.
as
No.
advice. It's not where you're thinking at all. But what's funny is, so I did that like right after leaving New York, at the height of my depression and self-doubt. I signed up for this 24-mile or 24-hour race. This was a whole thing. I was just like, I'm going to see if I can do this. And I did it. It was like insane. It was painful. There's like a whole video on it on YouTube with the journey. But little things like that just challenge what you think is possible. And I think there's also small ways you can do it as well with consistency. I like to learn from people that know a lot more than me and have more experience than me. And on this note, there's something I've heard from Alex Hermosi that I really like. And it's like when you're experiencing self-doubt and imposter syndrome, what you got to do is start taking action on who you think you are and who you want to be. And then just build up this this big stack of undeniable proof that you are who you say you are. And again, for me, that big thing was like oh, I can overcome something massive. But it's also the simple things like, I mean, I started a challenge. My birthday is November 1st. And since November 1st, I've been running a mile every morning, just building a consistency. Can I do this for a year? Because consistency is a muscle that I need to really build. Because sometimes I'm not the best at sticking to the things. I have so many ideas and that sort of thing. So I think it's somewhere in there where you're taking action on something that, yes, it's challenging yourself, but it's really just being the person that you say you are and building up this stack of undeniable proof that, again, it happens day by day. I don't think that's necessary. Fake it till you make it. It's just doing it because this is who I think I really authentically am. And then before you know it, you look behind you and you're like, oh, I've done some things. And so maybe I am who I say I am.
Damn. That gives me goosebumps, because personally speaking, this is kind of the journey that I've been on and oftentimes struggle with too, is like figuring out who authentically is Ginny, or who do I authentically want to be, and then trying to stay consistent to that.
I'm so glad
vision.
you said that. Yeah. I like that you said, who am I or who do I want to be? Because that's where I'd land too sometimes. Because then I'm like, well, am I really this way, or am I really like bad? And like, well, who do I want to be? Yeah. And again, I'm always stealing little things from people that know a lot better than me. And so there's something I've gotten from Brene Brown when you're in that decision point of out of those two, like who I really am and who I want to be, which one feels like a contraction and which one feels like an expansion. And whatever one feels like an expansion, lean into that one. That's why I choose New York over Austin, Texas, or Miami or LA. Like, I wanted to live in some big city, but the one that was the most expansive and scared me the most was New York City.
Wow.
And who you have to kind of be to be here long term.
Yeah, I love that like analogy about contraction and expansion. I haven't heard that before, so I absolutely love that. And I loved that when you were deciding whether you want to move to New York or not, you were mentioning about watching YouTube videos of New York life, because like how amazing to have this modern technology that helps you like actually visualize. Because one of the things about manifestation and manifesting the life you want is the ability to visualize that life and kind of normalizing it. And it's so hard because you have to like carve out time to actually do it in your head. But you just gave me something so simple, and yet it's like a light bulb just went on in my head when you said that, because I'm like, I can just visualize watching YouTube videos.
Totally. Make it normal. Do as much as you can. And you want to do a cool full circle. The guy's video I watched the most is a guy named Brett Conti. He was just right here on my sofa. We're friends. He's been on my podcast now. Like, it's so wild that I was just like walking through cornfields as a ex-cult kid, trying to figure out what I want to be, and like just visualizing it. Because if you can make it feel normal, get as close as you can to make it feel normal, then you can have it. It's not binary black and white. It's like improving the odds, like getting closer, and then all of a sudden when it happens, you're like, oh my gosh, it's here.
And then you kind of normalize it. Man, I can go on and on and on about this, but I do want to ask you your final question.
We'll have to...
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I think there's a bit of a lag.
I was just going to say, we'll have to, because I am due, because I love LA and Southern California due to the weather, and I'm due for a trip. So at some point, I'm sure we'll cross paths again and we can jam on growth and life philosophy at some other point.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah, let me know when you're in LA. So finally, with the future in mind, Calvin, as a visionary, what's in your vision? What does the future for you look like, and what impact do you hope to make?
The big, hairy, audacious goal, the vision I have for my life that I'm not fully built on yet, that I also set around the same time I decided to move to New York 3 years ago, is I want to make a living being me. That
Mm,
sounds really silly. Again, a couple online businesses are sustaining me and stuff like that. But I really want to take it up a notch. And that's a cool theme of this whole conversation with authenticity. I'm not fully monetized as making a living being myself, but it can do, like, the podcast just started monetizing. So there's like promising
yeah.
there, whether that's through
Mm,
conversation and that sort of thing. And the impact I want to make, that is so simple at this stage. Like, that's been something for a long time that I thought of. And what do I want to make? It's empowerment. I want to empower people. I want to, like, for positive change in their own life. I hear so many conversations online and offline, and it is so blaringly obvious to me now, having gone through this whole experience of living in a cult and leaving, that we hold ourselves back infinitely more than anything external.
yeah.
And it's the external things that actually seep into us that we
Mm,
then just accept. And we
mm,
think it's the
mm,
external thing, but it's actually the way we are interpreting the external thing that is holding
yeah.
us back. And so if any way I can remind someone of what they can do. Viktor
Mm,
Frankl was in the Nazi death camps of Germany, and I'm so inspired by his book, Man's Search for Meaning, on one simple point: that when he was so out of control and literally a prisoner, he found this one thing that nobody could take from him. And
mhm,
he explained it, just paraphrasing: between stimulus and response, there is a space. And then in that space is my ability to choose my response, and my ability to choose that response, that lies my growth and freedom. There's
mm,
something so empowering to that, to me, and inspiring, because even though I lived how I lived, I'm never going to have an experience that's quite as traumatic as Viktor Frankl did. And so, if sharing my life story in books I write, in businesses I build, in talks I do, I want to somehow remind humans of themselves, of the human spirit. We need it. We need people to realize, you have way more ability to create positive change in your life than a president, even
mm,
than
mhm,
than a politician. Like, there's something that you can do now that might be small but can stack and compound. So that's the
mm.
impact I want to make. Help people, empower people to make positive change in their own life.
I love that, Calvin. That was absolutely empowering and inspiring. And I loved having you on our show. If the audience wants to reach out to you, what's the best way they can find you?
Probably the podcast. Podcast is cultured, emphasis on the word cult. You can go to culturedpod.com to learn more, or just my Instagram. I do post every new episode on my Instagram. My Instagram is just Calvin Wayman, so that's a good place to hang out.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Calvin.